Hello and welcome back to Nightfall Lore. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Are you tucked in somewhere quiet, the lights already off, the world outside your window finally still? Are you wrapped in something warm, drifting in that comfortable space between the day you've finished and the sleep you're approaching? Or maybe you're somewhere unexpected tonight, headphones in, borrowing a few hours of someone else's story because your own thoughts are too loud to sleep through. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Take a breath, let your shoulders drop, let the tension you've been carrying today start to loosen. Tonight we're stepping into one of the most beautiful, devastating and emotionally intricate stories told in a video game in recent memory. This is the complete lore of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. A game that took the world by surprise when it arrived in 2025 and hasn't let go since. A game about death, about grief, about the fantasies we build to survive our losses, and about the terrible courage required to finally let those fantasies end. You don't need to have played it to follow tonight's story. You don't need to know the combat system or the turn-based mechanics or anything about how the game actually works as a game. All you need is exactly what you already have, a quiet space and a willingness to listen. Because the story of Expedition 33 is one that works on you slowly, that builds and builds until it arrives somewhere you genuinely didn't see coming, somewhere that leaves you sitting in the dark long after the credits have rolled, thinking about people who don't exist and grieving things that were never real. We'll begin in Lumière, the last city of humanity, a place of gaslit streets and desperate beauty where every citizen knows exactly how much time they have left. We'll follow Expedition 33 across a surreal, painted landscape toward a confrontation with a goddess who erases people from existence. And then, somewhere in the middle of that journey, the story will pull the ground out from under everything you thought you understood and will follow it into a much darker and much more human truth than any of us expected. If you drift away tonight, that's perfect. If you find yourself still awake somewhere in the later chapters, unable to sleep because the story has its hooks in you, that's wonderful too. There's no wrong way to be here. Just settle in. Let the rain carry you. And let me tell you about the last expedition and the painted world it was sent to destroy. One thing worth knowing before we begin. This is a story with a twist at its centre, not a cheap trick, not a subversion for the sake of surprise, but a genuine recontextualization of everything that came before it. The kind of narrative turn that makes you look back at every earlier scene differently, that makes small moments retroactively significant, that leaves you wanting to go back and read the beginning again with the knowledge you now carry. If you haven't played Expedition 33 and want to experience that surprise yourself, you may want to bookmark this video for after. But if you're here for the full story, told carefully from beginning to end, then we're going to cover all of it tonight. And I promise that knowing where it goes doesn't diminish the journey. If anything, understanding the destination makes the smaller moments more resonant, not less. The world of Expedition 33 is rendered with a visual beauty that's genuinely hard to describe in words alone. The Belle Epoque aesthetic, gas lamps, ironwork, cobblestones, high collars and elaborate dress, gives Lumière and its people a specific gravity, a sense that this is a culture with real depth and real history even before you know what that history is. The continent has a dream-like quality, environments that feel at once familiar and impossible, gorgeous and slightly wrong in ways that are easier to sense than to explain. The whole game looks like someone painted it very carefully, which is of course not an accident. The aesthetic choice and the story's central truth are the same truth, expressed in two different languages simultaneously. To understand Expedition 33, You have to understand the world it takes place in, and that world is unlike anything else in modern storytelling. A place built entirely around a single, terrible truth that every person within it accepts from the moment they're born. Death is not uncertain here, it is scheduled. It arrives on a specific day, at a specific age, with a precision that no disease or accident could ever match. And the agent of that death is not a war or a plague or a natural catastrophe. It is a woman with a paintbrush. The world of Expedition 33 is set in something like Belle Époque France. Cobblestone streets, gas lamps, ironwork balconies, high fashion and elaborate social rituals, a culture of art and science and romance pursued with what feels like feverish, almost desperate intensity. The visual language is immediately striking. This is a beautiful world. It is also a world in agony, and the beauty and the agony are completely inseparable. Because when you know exactly how much time you have left, you stop wasting any of it on things that don't matter. The name of the last human city is Lumière. It sits on an island, isolated and fortified, the last refuge of a species that has been shrinking for decades. And what has been shrinking it is something the people of Lumière call the Gommage. The Gommage is a ritual of erasure. Once a year, a being known as the Paintress, a figure of immense and terrifying power who lives somewhere far across the water, beyond the reach of ordinary humanity, wakes from her long sleep and paints a single number on a vast stone monolith that can be seen from Lumière's shores. The moment she paints that number, every person in the world whose age matches it is instantly and completely erased from existence, not killed in any conventional sense, not wounded or diseased, simply gone. One moment they're there, breathing and laughing and living, and the next moment they are smoke. And then not even that. The Gommage began when the monolith showed 100. At that point, everyone who was 100 years old vanished from the world. The following year, 99, then 98, then 97. The countdown has been running for 67 years by the time our story begins. And when we arrive in Lumière, the monolith shows 33. Think about what this means for the world that has grown up around it. There are no elderly people in Lumière. There haven't been for decades. The oldest citizens alive are in their early 30s, and they know with absolute certainty that they will not see 34. There are no grandparents, no elders to pass down wisdom or anchor the culture to a longer sense of history. Memory, in Lumière, dies with remarkable speed because the people who carry it have so little time to carry it. What emerges from this is a culture of extraordinary intensity. The people of Lumière love harder and faster and with less reservation than any society we recognise, because they have no choice. Romance blooms quickly, burns brightly, and is never taken for granted. Art is pursued with the urgency of someone who knows they won't see their work completed. Science is driven forward by researchers who won't live to see the full results of their experiments, but do it anyway, for those who come after. The phrase itself has become something close to sacred in Lumière. For those who come after. It is the sentence that justifies every sacrifice, every expedition, every death in service of a future that the person who dies won't get to see. Lumière has responded to the Gommage in the most human way imaginable. It has refused to accept it. Year after year, since the very beginning of the countdown, the city has organised what it calls an expedition. A group of its finest fighters and scientists, selected for their courage and their skill, tasked with crossing the water and reaching the Paintress and finding some way to stop her before she can paint another number. 32 expeditions have come before the one we're about to follow. None of them succeeded. Most of them didn't come back at all. The names of the fallen are carved into memorials throughout Lumiere's streets, a growing record of sacrifice that has become so long it's difficult to process as a list of individuals rather than a mass of numbers. To join an expedition is widely understood as a death sentence, and yet every year there are volunteers. Every year, there are people willing to make that sacrifice because someone has to go, and if they go, maybe this time it will be different. It is a beautiful and devastating way to organise a society around hope. Not naive hope, not willful ignorance of the odds. Everyone in Lumière knows the odds. But hope anyway, because the alternative is to stop trying, and the people of Lumière have never been the kind of people who stop trying. They built a city in the shadow of an annual apocalypse, and they filled it with music and art and love, and they kept sending expeditions even when every single one came back in failure or didn't come back at all. They call it courage. You could also call it stubbornness. In the world of Expedition 33, the difference between the two is hard to locate. The continent itself, the landmass that lies across the water, where the Paintress lives and where every expedition has been sent, is not a normal place. It is land that seems to have been shaped by the same force that paints the number on the monolith each year. A surreal and often beautiful landscape where the ordinary rules of geography give way to something stranger. You'll encounter environments that look like paintings rendered at impossible scale. Locations that feel like they were designed by an artist rather than formed by geological time. A world that is visually breathtaking and fundamentally wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate. The continent is populated by things called nevrons, creatures that serve as the Paintress's defenders, her antibodies, her means of eliminating the humans who cross the water to find her. The nevrons are strange and varied, more like works of art given violent life than conventional fantasy monsters. They resemble porcelain masks, unfinished sketches, discarded dolls brought to terrible purpose. They are hostile by design, attacking any expeditioner who ventures into their territory with the single-minded purpose of elimination. There are also Gestrels, an indigenous people of the continent who exist outside the conflict between humanity and the Paintress. The Gestrels are intelligent, principled, and obsessed with combat as a form of art and philosophy. They're not human enemies. They're not human allies in any straightforward sense. They have their own culture, their own code of honor, their own relationship to the world they inhabit. They are, in their way, one of the more thoughtful pieces of world building in the entire game. A reminder that the continent has its own history, its own complexity, that predates the human expeditions and will continue long after. The substance that powers most of what happens in this world is called chroma. It's a magical material that serves as the fundamental energy source of the continent, powering the nevrons embedded in the landscape, carried on the skin of certain expeditioners in markings called pictos that allow them to access its power in combat. Chroma is beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. It can heal and destroy. It can create and unmake. And it is, as we will eventually understand, connected to something much deeper about the nature of this world than it first appears. Chroma presents differently depending on who is using it and how. In combat, it is a weapon, a force that can be channeled through the pictos on a fighter's body into attacks of genuine power, capable of destroying nevrons that physical weapons alone might struggle to damage. In the landscape of the continent, it exists as a kind of ambient energy, flowing through certain areas with greater concentration, accumulating in places of significance the way water accumulates in low ground. The Gestrels seem to have a particular relationship with chroma that the expeditioners from Lumière don't fully understand, a cultural and possibly spiritual connection to its flow that gives them knowledge of the continent's rhythms that no amount of scientific study from outside could replicate. What the expeditioners don't know, can't know without the context they're still building toward, is that chroma is not merely the world's energy system, it is the world's substance. The continent is made of it the way a painting is made of pigment, not as the fuel that powers the world from underneath, but as the actual material of which the world consists. Every nevron, every landscape, every painted person in Lumière carries chroma within them, not as an energy source, but as the fundamental stuff of their existence. To run low on chroma in the canvas is not to run out of fuel, it is to begin to cease. This is the truth that the Gommage reveals, once you understand what the canvas is. The Gommage is the canvas consuming its own substance to stay alive. The people who vanish in the Gommage are not killed by an external force. Their chroma, the material of their being, is being reclaimed by the painted world to sustain itself for another year. The paintress paints the number not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of maintenance, of desperate, ongoing management of a world that costs more to sustain each year than the year before. This is the world that Expedition 33 departs into, and the people who depart into it carry the weight of 67 years of failure, the knowledge that they're almost certainly going to die, and the stubborn, irreducible conviction that someone has to try. What they don't know, what none of the 33 expeditions have known, is that the world they're walking into is not what it appears to be. The surreal quality of the continent, the way it doesn't quite behave like a natural place, the specific visual language of the nevrons, the sense that everything around them has been shaped by intention rather than time, all of this is accurate perception, not the distortion of fear. The continent is unusual because it was made, not because it formed. The canvas has seams if you know how to look for them, and the people of Lumière, who have lived inside the canvas their entire lives, have never had reason to look. The Gommage, understood in this fuller light, is even more tragic than it first appears. The people of Lumière experience it as an attack, a cruel, arbitrary erasure perpetrated by a distant and malevolent force. They have built their entire culture around surviving it and fighting it. Their bravest people die trying to stop it. And the mechanism beneath it is simply a world running short on the substance of its own existence, reaching backward into itself to find enough material to keep going for another year. The paintress paints the number not because she wants to kill anyone. She does it the way a doctor makes a decision they would rather not have to make, because the alternative is worse, and there is no third option available. There is a ceremony in Lumière that happens every year before the expedition departs. It is not cheerful. It has the quality of a funeral, solemn and beautiful, heavy with the awareness of what is being asked of the people standing at its centre. The city gathers at the docks. The expeditioners are dressed in their finest. There are speeches and music and flowers thrown into the water, and then they go, because there is nothing left to do but go. The ceremony has evolved over 67 years into something deeply layered. Not just a farewell, but a kind of ritual processing of everything that the city carries. The flowers thrown into the water are not just pretty. They're an act of acknowledgement. We know what we're asking of these people, and we're asking it anyway, and the flowers are how we hold both of those truths simultaneously. The music is not triumphant. It is not a march. It is something closer to a lullaby, which is appropriate because what Lumière is really doing is putting its bravest children to sleep in the kindest way it knows how, before the harder sleep that's coming. The families of the expeditioners line the docks. They don't try to stop anyone from going. Everyone understands that the going is necessary, that the choosing to go is an act of love for the people who will remain. But the weight on those dockside faces is not the weight of pride alone. It is the weight of people who know they are watching someone they love walk toward their probable death, and who are not allowed by the logic of the world they live in to ask them to stay. The expeditioners always say the same thing before they leave. The same phrase spoken to the crowd, spoken to each other, spoken quietly to themselves in the moments before departure. For those who come after, it is their purpose and their comfort and their justification all compressed into 5 words. They're going to die so that someone else might live longer. They are sacrificing themselves not for victory. They have no real expectation of victory, but for the possibility of victory, for the chance that this time will be different, that this expedition will be the one that finds a way where 32 before it found nothing but death. The history of the previous expeditions is a history of tragedy. The earliest ones, when the Gommage was still taking the very old, had the luxury of time. There were still people in their 80s and 70s and 60s who were committed to the fight but who could afford a certain patience. By the time the number reached the 50s and 40s, that patience had begun to curdle into something more desperate. The expeditions became more ambitious, their members more willing to take risks, their methods more extreme. And still the Paintress painted, and still the number fell. By the time the number reached 33, Lumière had been shaped irrevocably by this loss. The social fabric of the city is woven through with the names and stories of expeditioners who didn't come back. There are streets named for them. Children are named for them. The culture of the city carries the memory of 32 failed expeditions not as a record of defeat, but as a record of honour. These people tried, and trying is the most that any person in Lumière can do. The expeditioners who do return, the rare ones who make it back alive after their mission fails, carry something that doesn't have a clean name. It's not guilt exactly, though guilt is part of it. It's the specific weight of having survived something that others didn't, of having walked back through a door that closed forever behind the people who went with you. Some of them volunteer for the next expedition, because they find that waiting in Lumière is harder than going back out. Some of them disappear into quieter lives, unable to speak about what they saw. Some of them become the ones who train the next generation, because that's the only way they know to keep doing something useful with the time they have left. The expedition system itself has evolved over the decades into something close to a military institution. There are selection processes, training programs, hierarchies and ranks and specialized roles. Scientists who study the continent and the Paintress's powers go alongside fighters who have been trained from childhood in the techniques best suited to surviving the continent's dangers. The expeditions are organized, prepared, as ready as 67 years of accumulated knowledge can make them, which is to say, not nearly ready enough, because the continent keeps killing them, and the Paintress keeps painting, and the number keeps falling. What the expeditions have learned over the years, the knowledge bought with so many lives, is fragmentary and incomplete, but not nothing. They know about the Nevrons, they know about chroma, they know about the Gestrels and how to navigate relationships with them. They know about the geography of the continent, at least the parts that previous expeditions reached before the Nevrons overwhelmed them. Each failed expedition has left behind a slightly more detailed map of a place that keeps finding new ways to be deadly. And then the number reaches 33, and Expedition 33 forms, and the people who join it know something that makes their mission different from all the ones before in a way that is both simple and unbearable. They're 33 years old, or younger. When the Paintress paints next year, they will be the ones who vanish. This is not abstract for them. This is not a future that could be prevented or a fate that might be avoided. This is their specific personal calendared death. If they fail, they don't just fail the mission. They fail themselves in the most literal way possible. They will simply cease to exist on a day they could calculate the month. This knowledge changes something about how Expedition 33 approaches their mission. They have nothing to lose that they weren't already going to lose. They can afford a kind of recklessness that earlier expeditions couldn't, a willingness to push further and risk more, because the alternative isn't survival, it's waiting in Lumière to be erased on schedule. Better to die on the continent trying than to die at home waiting. This recklessness is its own kind of freedom. There is something almost clarifying about having nothing left to protect except the mission itself. Every previous expedition departed carrying the hope that some of them might come home, that the ones who survived could return to Lumière with knowledge or with victory. Expedition 33 departs knowing that even if they come home, home will not be there for them in a year. The Gommage will take them whether they succeed or fail, whether they return or don't. The only way to cheat death is to stop it at its source, and they either do that or they don't, and there is no middle outcome that preserves them personally. This is a peculiar gift disguised as a curse. Freedom from the fear of death is something that philosophers and warriors and mystics have sought for centuries, usually through mental discipline or spiritual practice or confrontation with mortality in controlled circumstances. Expedition 33 has it handed to them by the calendar. They know their death date. In knowing it, they are released from the uncertainty that makes death so frightening, and they can redirect the energy that uncertainty would have consumed into something more useful, into going further than any expedition before them, into doing what it takes. There's a bittersweet quality to the expedition members who chose to join, knowing that the number 33 will claim them if they fail, and possibly even if they succeed in coming home. They have, each of them, made a particular kind of peace with their own mortality that most people never have to make. Whether they arrived at that peace through courage or desperation or simple resignation varies from person to person, but they carry it across the water with them, that peace, and it is visible in how they move and how they speak and how they treat each other, with a specific tenderness that comes from knowing that the time is finite, that what is here right now may not be here much longer. That kindness is never wasted, even when the recipient might not be around long enough to remember it. For those who come after, every story about a group of people on a desperate mission lives or dies by the characters. And Expedition 33 is, before it becomes anything else, a story about a small group of people who walk into impossible danger together and form the kind of bonds that only that specific kind of pressure creates. Let's meet them. Gustave is the leader of Expedition 33, and he is, at first impression, exactly the kind of man you expect to lead a group like this. Competent, serious, responsible, carrying the weight of his role with the steady composure of someone who has thought very carefully about what he's getting himself into. But underneath that composure is a grief that informs everything he does. The year before our story begins, the Gommage took someone he loved. Her name was Sophie. She was 34 years old when the number fell to 34, and she was gone. Sophie's erasure is the wound at the centre of Gustave's story. He doesn't speak about it constantly. He's too controlled for that, too committed to his role as the person who holds the expedition together. But everything he does, every decision he makes, every moment of genuine emotion that breaks through his carefully maintained composure carries Sophie's absence within it. He is here, on this expedition, because of her. Not to avenge her. You can't avenge someone who is erased. Because watching someone he loved simply cease to exist at the Paintress's arbitrary command turned his grief into something with teeth. He's going to find a way to end this, or he is going to die trying, and either way he's not going to sit in Lumière and wait. Maelle is young, younger than she should be to join an expedition, younger than the selection process typically allows. She's Gustave's ward in some sense, a girl he's looked after and taken responsibility for, and she has forced her way onto this expedition through a combination of raw talent and sheer stubbornness that Gustave recognises even as he worries about it. Maelle is fierce and warm in equal measure, quick to anger and quick to laugh, with an emotional directness that contrasts sharply with Gustave's careful composure. She shouldn't be here. She knows that. She came anyway. What you don't know about Maelle, what the story holds back until its most devastating revelation, is something we'll return to later. For now, know only that she is one of the most important people in this expedition, and that her importance is not fully visible for a long time. Lune is the scientist of the group, the one who approaches everything, including mortal danger, with the focused curiosity of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting and wants to understand how it works. She studies chroma with an intensity that borders on obsession, not because she doesn't understand the stakes, but because understanding is how she deals with the stakes. If she can figure out how the Paintress's power works, how the nevrons are created, how chroma flows through the continent, maybe she can find a weakness that nobody before her has found. This is her logic. It's not naive. Lune is not naive about anything, but it is the kind of determined optimism that comes from believing that problems have solutions if you're smart enough and persistent enough to find them. Ciel is harder to read than the others, quieter and more self-contained, with a past she carries close, and a fighting style that suggests someone who has been in serious danger before and emerged from it with a clarity about her own capabilities that most people spend their whole lives trying to achieve. She is precise and lethal in combat and genuinely caring in the quieter moments, a combination that initially seems contradictory and eventually just seems like a whole person. Ciel represents something important in the expedition's emotional ecology, the one who can be depended on to do what needs to be done without needing to talk about it, whose reliability is itself a form of love, even if it's a form that's harder to recognise than the more expressive kinds. The dynamic between these four people, Gustave's controlled grief, Maelle's fierce directness, Lune's intellectual optimism, Ciel's quiet precision, creates a group with real texture, real friction, real moments of both tenderness and difficulty. They complement each other in ways that feel organic rather than designed, and the tensions between them are honest tensions, the kind that arise not from character flaws but from the collision of different ways of being in the world that each work perfectly well in isolation and occasionally clash in proximity. There are others in the expedition when it departs, more members, more fighters and scientists and specialists who board the ships with Gustave and sail toward the continent with the same grim determination as everyone else. Most of them don't survive the first encounter with what's waiting on the other side of the water. The dark shores, as they come to be called, are where expeditions go to be broken. The nevrons that guard the initial landing zones have destroyed expedition after expedition at exactly this point, and they do it again here, brutally efficiently before the group has had any time to get their bearings or prepare for the scale of what they're facing. The Dark Shores sequence is one of the most effective pieces of early storytelling in the game, not because of its spectacle, though it has spectacle, but because of what it establishes emotionally. You arrive on the continent with a group. The group has faces and names and the beginning of personalities, and then the Nevrons arrive, and the group is decimated, and what you're left with is a smaller, shaken cluster of survivors trying to process what just happened while already knowing they have to keep going. There is no time for grief here. The mission doesn't pause for grief. You pocket it and move forward, and the grief becomes something you carry rather than something you can put down. What remains after the Dark Shores is a smaller group, and it is from this smaller group, bound together by the shared violence of what they've survived and the shared impossibility of what lies ahead, that the heart of our story forms. Gustave, Maelle, Lune, Ciel, and the few others who are still standing. They have made it past the point where 32 expeditions before them were stopped. They are deeper into the continent than any living person from Lumière has been. And the Paintress is still somewhere ahead of them, and the number is still 33, and there's nothing to do but keep going. The relationships that develop between these characters as they travel are one of the genuine joys of Expedition 33's storytelling. These are not people who become friends through a series of convenient bonding moments. They become something more complicated than friends. People who know each other's fears and watch each other fail and help each other up anyway. People who argue and disagree and hurt each other in the small, thoughtless ways that people do when they spend too much time in too much danger together. The love between them, when it arrives, and it does arrive in various forms at various points, is the kind of love that is inseparable from the context in which it was forged. It is expedition love, crisis love, the love of people who have no time to pretend. One of the things Expedition 33 does uncommonly well is the depiction of how grief travels with people. Gustave's grief for Sophie is not something he left behind in Lumière when he departed. It is a passenger, present in every decision he makes, audible in the specific quality of silence he keeps in certain moments. Lune's relationship with grief is more intellectual, more processed through the mechanism of understanding. If she can figure out how the system works, she doesn't have to sit with the feeling of powerlessness that grief carries. Maelle doesn't yet know she is grieving something she cannot name, a self she has forgotten. These are not characters who have resolved their losses. They are characters in the middle of them, and that specificity of unresolved feeling is what makes them real. The game spends real time on the quieter moments between the expedition members, the conversations that don't advance the plot but deepen the sense of who these people are to each other. Two characters sitting somewhere, one of them unable to sleep, talking about something small and specific. These scenes are not filler. They are the actual substance of what makes the larger story land. You cannot feel the weight of losing someone you haven't first learned to care about. Expedition 33 makes sure you care, and it does it in the oldest and most reliable way available, by showing you people being real with each other when no one is watching. The continent up close is stranger and more beautiful than any description can quite capture. It does not behave like a normal landscape. The geography shifts and changes in ways that suggest intention rather than geology. Locations exist that seem to have been designed rather than formed. Places of such specific visual character, such deliberate aesthetic, that you begin to wonder, long before the game tells you to wonder, whether the world you're travelling through might be something other than a natural place. The expedition moves through environments that range from the hauntingly familiar to the genuinely alien. There are forests where the trees are too symmetrical, meadows where the flowers grow in patterns that suggest arrangement rather than growth, ruins that look like they were built by someone who was imagining what ruins should look like, rather than simply allowing structures to decay. There is beauty everywhere, and it is the beauty of something made rather than something that happened. The Nevrons you face throughout the journey are deeply strange. They emerge from the landscape as though part of it, as though the continent itself is generating them, producing new defenders each time the old ones fall. Their designs don't follow any conventional logic of evolution or biology. They look like art. They look like the kind of creatures someone might paint if they were trying to imagine what monsters should look like, drawing on mythologies and nightmares and the shapes that scare us when we can't quite name why. Fighting them feels less like combat with wildlife, and more like combat with the imagination itself, with something that shouldn't exist but does, because something willed it into existence. Your encounters with the Gestrals are among the more unexpected pleasures of the journey. They are beings of genuine culture and complexity, with their own language and their own social structures, and their own relationship to the continent that has nothing to do with the Gommage or Lumière or the Paintress's countdown. They exist in the same space as the expedition, but not in the same war. They are not trying to reach the Paintress. They are not trying to survive the Gommage. They are simply living on the continent as they have always lived. And the expeditioners who learn to approach them with respect rather than aggression find in them something valuable. A perspective on the continent from someone who has always been here, who knows its rhythms and its dangers in ways that no expedition from Lumière can replicate. There is one Gestrel in particular, Eski, whose presence alongside the expedition becomes one of the more emotionally resonant threads of the entire story. Eski is not a warrior in the way the others are. Eski is something warmer and stranger, a companion whose nature, like much of the world of Expedition 33, is not fully what it initially appears to be. We'll return to what Eski actually is later, when the story gives us the context to understand it. For now, know that the bond that forms between Eski and the expeditioners is genuine, and that it matters more than it seems. As the expedition travels deeper into the continent, they begin to find evidence of the expeditions that came before them. Not just the physical remnants, weapons, supplies, the scattered equipment of people who didn't come home, but something more disturbing. Evidence that some of the previous expeditioners are still here, not dead, not entirely, present in the continent in a way that doesn't make sense under the assumptions the expedition brought with them from Lumière. The specific nature of these presences is unsettling precisely because it doesn't fit any category the expeditioners have available to understand it. These are not ghosts in the traditional sense, not transparent echoes or insubstantial memories. They are fully present, fully physical, fully themselves as far as anyone can determine. They speak, they remember, they have their own agendas within the continent, their own reasons for being where they are, their own relationships to the landscape and the Nevrons and the ongoing drama of whatever the canvas is doing around them. Some of them seem to have been here for years, even decades. Some of them no longer fully remember Lumière. Some of them are fighting still, in the way that soldiers sometimes keep fighting a war they don't know has ended. Understanding what these people are, why they're here, what happened to them that they didn't die and didn't come home, is one of the central mysteries of the journey's second half. And when the answer arrives, it doesn't just explain their presence, it explains everything. This is where the story begins to ask questions it isn't ready to answer yet. How can people who left Lumière years ago still be on the continent? What happened to them that they didn't die and didn't come home? The expedition begins to encounter figures who feel like echoes of people who should be gone, presences whose existence in this place doesn't fit the simple story of they tried, they failed, they died. Something else happened, and understanding what happened to the previous expeditioners turns out to be inseparable from understanding what this world actually is. The Paintress's influence is felt throughout the journey long before you reach her. The continent responds to her in ways that suggest she is not simply an inhabitant of this world, but in some sense its author, a force that shapes it through will rather than through the ordinary mechanisms of cause and effect. When the expedition gets close enough to places of particular significance, when they touch certain truths that the world seems to be trying to keep hidden, the response is immediate and violent. The Nevrons multiply. The landscape shifts. It is as though the world itself is defending something. And then Renoir appears. Renoir enters the story at a point when you think you understand what this game's about. A suicide mission against an unkillable goddess, told with unusual emotional depth and aesthetic brilliance. His appearance does not immediately upend that understanding. He presents as an antagonist of a relatively familiar type, someone who stands between the expedition and its goal, someone who's been working against them for reasons that aren't yet clear. He is formidable and mysterious, and clearly part of some larger scheme that the expedition is only beginning to understand. But Renoir's true nature, his actual motivations, his relationship to both the Paintress and the world the expedition is travelling through, all of this is part of the revelation that the game holds back until exactly the right moment, and that moment, when it comes, changes everything. Before it arrives, though, the journey itself has changed the expedition. The continent has a way of doing this, not through grand revelations or dramatic confrontations alone, but through the accumulated weight of everything they encounter. They have seen things that Lumiere's records didn't prepare them for. They have found places on the continent that feel different from everything else, that carry a specific emotional resonance, as if they were made with a specific feeling in mind rather than growing organically over time. They have faced Nevrons that, when you look at them carefully enough, seem less like natural predators and more like expressions of something. Fear, grief, the desire to push away what threatens something precious. None of them have words for this yet, but all of them feel it, in the particular way that you feel something true before you can articulate why it's true. The world they're in is not what it looks like. They don't know what it is, but the wrongness is there, just below the surface of everything, waiting for the moment when they have enough pieces to assemble into a picture. What is striking in retrospect is how close the clues are to the surface throughout this section of the story. The game doesn't hide the canvas, it displays it in plain sight, trusting that players will assume what they're meant to assume. The painted quality of the environment, the specific way the Nevrons move, the areas of the continent that seem more emotionally resonant than geographically motivated. All of this is the canvas showing itself to anyone who knows how to look. But the frame story is strong enough that we don't know how to look yet. We are, in a sense, making the same mistake that every expedition made before us, taking the world at face value, because that's what we know how to do. Chapter 5. The first great twist. There is a point in Expedition 33's story, roughly at the end of what the game calls its first act, when the ground drops out. The expedition has been fighting toward the Paintress, encountering Nevrons and Gestrels and the mysteries of the continent, beginning to understand the shape of a world that is stranger than it first appeared. And then something happens that reframes everything they, and you, thought you understood. The first revelation comes in pieces, as the best revelations do. It begins with the discovery that the previous expedition's members who are still present on the continent are not simply survivors in any conventional sense. They are something else. They are painted people, figures who exist in this world the way a character exists in a story, created rather than born, present rather than native. The distinction matters more than it initially sounds like it should. A painted person is not a real person. Or rather, and this is where the game's philosophical complexity begins to make itself felt, a painted person may be a real person in every way that matters, but they came into existence through an act of creation rather than through natural processes. They were made. They were willed into being by someone with the power to will things into being. And in this world, that power has a specific name and a specific source. The Paintress made them, not in the sense of having physically constructed them, not assembled from parts or sculpted from raw material, made in the sense of having imagined them so completely, with such overwhelming creative force that they became real within the world she created. Because the world she created is itself a painted thing, a canvas. This is the revelation that defines everything that comes after. The continent is not a real continent. Lumière is not a real city. The Gommage, the expeditions, the Nevrons, the Gestrels, the chroma that flows through the landscape. None of it is real in the way the word real implies something that exists independently of any author's intention. All of it is a painting. The entire world you have been travelling through, the entire history and culture and tragedy of a civilization counting down toward its own erasure, exists within an enormous act of sustained creative will. It is a canvas, and the paintress is not its destroyer. She is its creator. She is its god. And she is, as we will eventually understand, someone in a tremendous amount of pain. When this truth arrives, you sit with it for a moment, because it seems to undercut everything. If the world is a painting, if the people in it are painted people, does anything that has happened matter? Does Gustave's grief for Sophie matter if Sophie was a painted character who was erased not because of some cosmic injustice, but simply because that's part of the story the canvas tells? Does Maelle's courage mean anything if Maelle is a construct? The game's answer to these questions is one of its most profound contributions. Yes, all of it matters. The painted people are real. Their loves and fears and griefs are real. The relationships that form between them are real. The courage and sacrifice of every expedition that crossed the water was real. Existing within a painting does not make your existence less valid, does not make your suffering less genuine, does not make your life less yours. The canvas is a world, and the people in it are its people, and none of them deserve less consideration or less care simply because someone made them. This argument, quiet, philosophical, made through the texture of the story rather than through dialogue or exposition, is one of the reasons Expedition 33 stayed with people long after they finished it. Because it is an argument about more than painted worlds. It is an argument about the relationship between origin and value, about whether the circumstances of your creation determine your worth, about whether a life that was made rather than born is less of a life. The game's answer is no, and it makes that answer feel earned rather than declared, because by the time the revelation arrives, you have spent hours with the painted people of Lumière and loved them, and the idea that their lives don't matter simply because someone made them is not something you can accept. You know better. You have watched them live. But who made them? And why? Before we go deeper into the heart of this story, I want to take a moment. If you've made it this far, you're either still awake because the story has its hooks in you, which means you should maybe stop fighting it, or you're drifting pleasantly through the middle chapters in that half-asleep space where the words wash over you, like water. Either way, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend part of your night with a story that I think genuinely deserves this kind of slow, careful attention. If Expedition 33's story is moving you the way it moved me when I first encountered it, if you're finding the questions it asks worth sitting with, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe to Nightfall Lore. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that these long, careful deep dives are worth making. And if you have a favourite moment or character from Expedition 33, drop it in the comments. I read every one, and knowing what resonated with you shapes what comes next. For now, settle back in. The deeper layers of this story are about to open up. Let me tell you who the Paintress actually is and why she made the world. There is a point in Expedition 33's story, roughly at the end of what the game calls its first act, when the ground drops out. The expedition has been fighting toward the Paintress, encountering Nevrons and Gestrels and the mysteries of the continent, beginning to understand the shape of a world that is stranger than it first appeared. And then something happens that reframes everything they, and you, thought you understood. The first revelation comes in pieces, as the best revelations do. It begins with the discovery that the previous expedition's members who are still present on the continent are not simply survivors in any conventional sense. They are something else. They are painted people, figures who exist in this world the way a character exists in a story, created rather than born, present rather than native. The distinction matters more than it initially sounds like it should. A painted person is not a real person, or rather, and this is where the game's philosophical complexity begins to make itself felt, a painted person may be a real person in every way that matters, but they came into existence through an act of creation rather than through natural processes. They were made. They were willed into being by someone with the power to will things into being. And in this world, that power has a specific name and a specific source. The Paintress made them, not in the sense of having physically constructed them, not assembled from parts or sculpted from raw material, made in the sense of having imagined them so completely, with such overwhelming creative force that they became real within the world she created. Because the world she created is itself a painted thing, a canvas. This is the revelation that defines everything that comes after. The continent is not a real continent. Lumière is not a real city. The Gommage, the expeditions, the nevrons, the gestrels, the chroma that flows through the landscape, none of it is real in the way the word real implies something that exists independently of any author's intention. All of it is a painting. The entire world you have been travelling through, the entire history and culture and tragedy of a civilization counting down toward its own erasure, exists within an enormous act of sustained creative will. It is a canvas, and the Paintress is not its destroyer. She is its creator. She is its god. And she is, as we will eventually understand, someone in a tremendous amount of pain. When this truth arrives, you sit with it for a moment, because it seems to undercut everything. If the world is a painting, if the people in it are painted people, does anything that has happened matter? Does Gustave's grief for Sophie matter? If Sophie was a painted character who was erased not because of some cosmic injustice, but simply because that's part of the story the canvas tells? Does Maelle's courage mean anything if Maelle is a construct? The game's answer to these questions is one of its most profound contributions. Yes, all of it matters. The painted people are real. Their loves and fears and griefs are real. The relationships that form between them are real. The courage and sacrifice of every expedition that crossed the water was real. Existing within a painting does not make your existence less valid, does not make your suffering less genuine, does not make your life less yours. The canvas is a world, and the people in it are its people, and none of them deserve less consideration or less care simply because someone made them. This argument, quiet, philosophical, made through the texture of the story rather than through dialogue or exposition, is one of the reasons Expedition 33 stayed with people long after they finished it. Because it is an argument about more than painted worlds. It is an argument about the relationship between origin and value, about whether the circumstances of your creation determine your worth, about whether a life that was made rather than born is less of a life. The game's answer is no, and it makes that answer feel earned rather than declared, because by the time the revelation arrives, you have spent hours with the painted people of Lumière and loved them, and the idea that their lives don't matter simply because someone made them is not something you can accept. You know better. You have watched them live. But who made them, and why? Before we go deeper into the heart of this story, I want to take a moment. If you've made it this far, you're either still awake because the story has its hooks in you, which means you should maybe stop fighting it, or you're drifting pleasantly through the middle chapters in that half-asleep space where the words wash over you like water. Either way, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend part of your night with a story that I think genuinely deserves this kind of slow, careful attention. If Expedition 33's story is moving you the way it moved me when I first encountered it, if you're finding the questions it asks worth sitting with, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe to Nightfall Lore. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that these long, careful, deep dives are worth making. And if you have a favourite moment or character from Expedition 33, drop it in the comments. I read every one, and knowing what resonated with you shapes what comes next. For now, settle back in. The deeper layers of this story are about to open up. Let me tell you who the Paintress actually is, and why she made the world. The canvas is not an accident. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is not the product of some impersonal magical force that operates independently of any specific will or desire. The canvas was made by a person, a specific person, with specific reasons, in a specific moment of grief so overwhelming that creating an entire world seemed like the only way to survive it. Her name is Aline. Aline Dessendre was in the world outside the canvas, the real world, a world that the canvas exists within the way, a painting exists within the room that contains it. A woman of remarkable power. The Dessendre are a family with the ability to paint worlds. This sounds fantastical, and it is. But within the logic of Expedition 33's universe, it is also simply true. They are people who can create, through the act of painting, things that actually exist. Not representations of things, not images. Actual things, actual places, actual people, called into being through a creative act that is indistinguishable from the creative acts of whatever force originally made the universe. Aline used this power in the most human way imaginable. She used it to grieve. Her son died. His name was Verso, and he was young, and his death was sudden and violent and senseless. A fire at the family home, the kind of catastrophe that doesn't have a reason, and doesn't offer comfort and simply leaves a hole in the world where a person used to be. Verso saved his sister Alicia from the fire. He got her out. He died doing it. And in saving her, he ensured that Alicia survived with burns that marked her for life. A constant physical reminder of what was lost and what was spared. Aline could not process this. The grief was too large. She had the power to make worlds, and she used that power the way any grieving mother might use whatever power she had at her disposal. She made a world where Verso still existed, not where the fire never happened. The past was the past, even for someone with her power. But a world, a canvas, where a version of Verso lived and breathed and moved and was present in the way that he was no longer present in the real world. She went into that world and she stayed there. She became, within the canvas, the Paintress, a figure of enormous power who created and sustained this painted world, who used the Gommage as a mechanism to maintain it, who generated the Nevrons as its immune system, and shaped its geography through her ongoing creative will. She did not think of herself as doing something harmful. She thought of herself as surviving. She thought of herself as maintaining a space where she could be close to the echo of her son, where she could exist in a world that still contained something like him. The Verso who lives in the canvas is not the real Verso. Ellie knows this, but he is also not nothing. He is a painted person, called into existence with such completeness of imagination that he is real within the canvas. Real in the way all the people of Lumière are real. Real in the way Gustave and Maelle and Lune and Ciel are real. He walks and thinks and feels and chooses. He is Aline's son in every sense except the one that matters most to her, which is that he exists in the real world, which he does not. And the Gommage is the canvas's way of dying. Not intentionally. It is not something Aline designed as a cruelty. It is a byproduct of the canvas's nature. A painted world cannot sustain an infinite population forever. Chroma, the substance that powers everything in the canvas, is not unlimited. As the canvas ages, as its population grows and ages with it, the chroma available to sustain all of its lives begins to run short. The gommage is the canvas culling itself, making room, ensuring that there is enough left to keep running, to keep Verso alive, to keep Aline's grief-made paradise functioning. The people of Lumière do not know this. They cannot know this. From inside the canvas, the gommage appears as an external attack, a cosmic injustice inflicted upon them by a malevolent goddess. They respond to it with exactly the courage and determination that the situation appears to demand. They form expeditions. They send their bravest and their best across the water to fight something that is not, at its core, what it appears to be. Every expedition that has crossed the water has been fighting the wrong war, not through any fault of their own. They had no way of knowing the truth. But the enemy is not a monster, and the canvas is not a battlefield, and the solution to the gommage is not a weapon. Understanding this is the beginning of everything that comes after. What we don't often stop to think about, in the midst of everything else the canvas revelation asks us to process, is what it must have been like for Aline during those 67 years. She's inside the canvas with painted Verso, surrounded by the world she made, watching it fill with people who don't know they're painted, watching them build lives and fall in love and go to war against her own defences year after year. She's both the god of this world and its most isolated inhabitant, the only one who knows what it truly is, the only one who carries the full weight of its contradiction. She made it to stop being alone in her grief, and in making it, she created a loneliness that is arguably more complete than anything the real world would have given her. Because you cannot really be close to people who don't know you're their creator. Aline cannot tell painted Verso what he is. She cannot tell the people of Lumière what they are. The relationship she can have with any of them is necessarily partial, necessarily asymmetrical, necessarily bounded by the thing she knows, and they don't. She has made an entire world of companions who cannot actually companion her in the way she needs, because the thing she needs is someone to share the full truth with, and the full truth is the one thing she cannot share. This is the quiet horror at the centre of the canvas. Not the gommage, not the nevrons, not even the exploitation of all those painted lives in service of one woman's grief. The quiet horror is that it didn't work. Aline made the canvas to survive her loss, and the canvas has kept her alive, but it has not brought her back to herself. She is suspended inside her grief the same way she was suspended inside it when she first entered, preserved by the very thing that was supposed to heal her. The specific tragedy of this situation is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. 67 years of expeditions, 32 failed attempts to kill a goddess who is not a destroyer, but a grieving mother. Hundreds of people who walked into the dark shores and didn't come back, who died in service of a mission that was based on a misunderstanding so fundamental that no amount of courage or skill or sacrifice could have bridged the gap. They were brave. They were genuinely, completely brave, and they were fighting the wrong thing. This is not a comfortable thought, and Expedition 33 doesn't try to make it comfortable. The courage of the expeditioners is real. The honour of their sacrifice is real. None of it is diminished by the fact that they didn't know what they were actually facing. But the knowledge that all those lives were lost in service of a misunderstanding, that the Paintress was never a monster, that the canvas was always a mother's grief, that the weapon they needed was never a weapon at all, sits heavily in you as the story moves forward, and it should. To understand what Expedition 33 is really about, you have to understand the family at the centre of it. The Dessendre are not a simple family. They're a collection of people doing their best in the aftermath of a catastrophe, making choices with incomplete information and genuine love, and nevertheless causing tremendous harm. They are deeply human in the worst and best senses of that phrase. Aline has already been introduced as the mother who made the canvas, but she didn't make it alone exactly. The canvas began with her, but it was sustained and shaped by the painted people she created within it, including painted versions of people she knew in the real world, people whose presence she needed in her grief-made paradise. Verso, the painted Verso, is one of the people you play alongside in the canvas. He is not the real Verso who died in the fire. He is a creation, called into existence by his mother's memory and longing. But within the canvas, he is completely real, completely himself, with no awareness that he is anything other than what he appears to be. He lives in Lumière. He's a person of the canvas, shaped by its rules and its culture, formed by Aline's vision of what her son might have become if he had lived. Alicia is the daughter who survived the fire. In the real world, Alicia carries the physical and psychological scars of what happened at the Dessendre home. She watched her brother die, saving her. She lives with that knowledge in her body, in the burns that mark her skin, in the grief that she shares with her mother but cannot process in the same way. Alicia is practical where Aline became visionary. She wants to live in the real world, to find a way forward in the actual present, not in a painted version of the past. And then there is Renoir. Aline's husband, Verso and Alicia's father, is a man of immense power and deeply compromised judgment. Renoir is not a villain in the conventional sense, and understanding this is essential to understanding the moral complexity that Expedition 33 is working with. He's a man who loves his wife, who has watched her retreat so completely into grief and fantasy that she has become unreachable in the real world, who is desperate to bring her back and who cannot accept the alternative. Renoir entered the canvas to try to pull Aline out. He went in with the intention of reaching her, of making her see that she needed to come back, that the real world still had things worth returning to, including him, including Alicia, including the life they still had left to build even in the shadow of Verso's death. He believed that Aline's retreat into the canvas was a crisis, a breakdown, and that the loving thing to do was to help her out of it rather than allow her to remain in it. He was not wrong about this, and he was also not right about this. These two things are simultaneously true, and they are the engine of the story's moral complexity. Because the canvas, whatever its origins in grief and delusion, is now a world. The people within it are real. The Gommage, whatever its cause, is genuinely erasing those people, and Renoir's plan for ending Aline's fantasy, his method of helping her see that it was time to come back, involves hastening the canvas's collapse, which means hastening the destruction of the world within it, which means the end of every painted person in Lumière and on the continent and everywhere the canvas extends. Renoir is trying to save his wife by ending an entire world of people. He has told himself that those people aren't really real, that they're constructs, that their existence is part of the delusion he's trying to end. He is wrong about this, but he is committed to this position deeply enough that he cannot step back from it. His Nevrons, the creatures he created to weaken the Paintress, to drain Aline's power and force the canvas toward collapse, are killing painted people who don't deserve to die in service of a plan whose logic breaks down the moment you accept that the painted people have genuine lives. Clair is Alicia's sister, and she is the one who sent Alicia into the canvas in the first place. Clair, outside the canvas, understood what Renoir was trying to do and wanted to help. She believed, not unreasonably, that if Alicia could reach Aline within the canvas, could speak to her as the daughter she loved, could make her see that there was still something to come back to, Aline might be, persuaded to leave, so Clair helped Alicia go in. And the moment Alicia entered the canvas, Aline's chroma, the raw creative force of the painted world, overwhelmed her. Alicia lost her memories. She was absorbed into the canvas, transformed by it, remade by it into someone who fit its world. She became Maelle. She grew up in Lumière as a painted person, surrounded by painted people, with no memory of the real world or of the family she came from, or of the reason she entered the canvas in the first place. This is the revelation that changes Maelle. This is why she is the most important person in Expedition 33 by the story's end. Not because she was the most powerful fighter or the most brilliant scientist, but because she is uniquely both real and painted, a person from outside the canvas who has lived inside it as one of its own people, who has real-world existence and canvas existence simultaneously, who carries within her the capacity to understand both sides of an impossible choice. The Dessendre family, taken as a whole, is a portrait of how love can ripple outward and cause damage to people far removed from its original source. Aline's love for Verso created the canvas. Renoir's love for Aline sent him into it and set him on a path of destruction. Clair's love for her family sent Alicia in to try to fix what Renoir couldn't. And Alicia's love for a mother she barely knew, a mother whose grief she couldn't yet understand, led her into a transformation that erased her entirely and rebuilt her as someone new. None of these people intended harm. Every link in this chain connects back to love, specific, genuine, recognizable love. And the harm it caused was real and large, and has affected every painted person who ever lived within the canvas without knowing any of this history existed. The people of Lumière paid for the Dessendre's grief with the Gommage, year after year, without ever knowing why. This is not a story where the villain was evil. It is a story where people who loved each other made choices that had consequences they couldn't predict and couldn't control. That is harder to make peace with than a villain with a clear motivation. It is also, for that reason, closer to the truth of how most damage actually gets done in the world. One more figure in the Dessendre family deserves mention before we move on, and that is the real-world Verso himself, or rather, the fragment of him that still persists. The boy who appears without a face in certain parts of the canvas, the presence that flickers at the edges of things, is not simply a memory or a symbol. He is, in some specific and technical sense within the story's metaphysics, the last piece of the real Verso soul. Aline's love was so complete, her creative power so enormous, that when she made the canvas in his image, she captured something of what he actually was. Not just her memory of him, but a fragment of him that had nowhere else to go after the fire. This fragment does not want to continue. It is tired. It has been sustaining the canvas from within, in ways the painted Verso doesn't fully understand for 67 years. It wants peace in a way that is not dramatic or angry, but simply honest. The way that someone who has been working without rest for a very long time eventually simply needs to stop. The faceless boy who occasionally appears in the canvas is this fragment asking, in the only way it can, for permission to be done, and that request is at the centre of the choice the story eventually places in your hands. Renoir is the most morally complicated figure in Expedition 33's story, and that complexity is part of what makes him so memorable, and so difficult to fully dismiss, even at the moments when you most want to. He's not trying to destroy the world because he enjoys destruction. He is trying to save his wife. These two things are inseparable in his mind, and the tragic truth of his situation is that both can be simultaneously true. He can be acting from genuine love and still be doing something monstrous. Love, in Expedition 33's universe, is not a justification, It is a motive, and motives, however sympathetic, do not change the consequences of actions. Renoir entered the canvas with a clear intention. Reach Aline. Show her the real world is waiting. Bring her home. What he found when he got there was something more complicated. He found a world. Not an obvious illusion, not a crude imitation of reality that could easily be dismissed as fantasy. A full, functioning, complex world with its own history and culture, and people who had been living in it for as long as Aline had been sustaining it. He found Lumière, with its cobblestoned beauty and its desperate courage, and its 32 failed expeditions and its tradition of sacrifice. And he found painted Verso. Meeting the painted version of his dead son in the canvas must have been one of the most disorienting experiences imaginable. Here was a person who looked like Verso, sounded like Verso, moved like Verso, who had all the surface characteristics of the son Renoir had lost, and who was absolutely not Verso, could not be Verso, was a creation built from Aline's memory and grief and love and the specific shape of her loss. Renoir could not let himself believe the painted Verso was real. If he believed that, then ending the canvas would mean killing his son a second time. So he didn't believe it. He committed to the position that the canvas's people were not real, and he built his entire plan on that commitment, and he proceeded. His method was indirect because it had to be. He couldn't simply destroy the canvas from outside. The mechanism doesn't work that way. But he could weaken the Paintress from within. He could create nevrons, powerful enough to drain Aline's chroma, to reduce her capacity to sustain the canvas, to push the painted world toward a collapse that would force Aline to choose between maintaining it and letting it go. He worked with Clair from outside the canvas, coordinating, strategizing, applying pressure in ways designed to accelerate the inevitable. The nevrons are, in this light, not monsters in the conventional sense. They are instruments of a plan, crude and violent and destructive instruments, yes, but instruments nonetheless. The fact that they kill people doesn't register to Renoir as the moral catastrophe it should, because he has convinced himself that the people they kill aren't real enough to count. This is the central lie of Renoir's position, and it is a lie he tells himself with such conviction that you can understand it even as you reject it. The need to believe that the people we harm don't count as real, that our justifications for the harm we do are sufficient to outweigh the harm itself. This is one of the oldest and most persistent human errors, and Expedition 33 uses it with uncommon precision. What makes Renoir genuinely tragic rather than simply villainous is that his relationship with the canvas, with the painted people within it, with painted Verso in particular, evolves over time in ways he didn't intend and cannot fully control. He cannot help loving painted Verso. He cannot help responding to the person in front of him, who carries all of Verso's qualities, who shares his name and his face and the specific warmth of him. He tells himself it doesn't count. He continues his plan. But something in him knows that he is lying, and that knowing corrodes him slowly, and that by the end of his arc in this story he is a man who has done something he cannot entirely defend even to himself. When you encounter Renoir as an enemy in the game, fighting him carries a specific weight that's different from fighting the nevrons or the other obstacles the expedition faces. You're not fighting something mindless or malevolent. You're fighting a grieving father who made catastrophically wrong choices, who wielded real power in service of real love and caused real harm. Defeating him does not feel like triumph. It feels like the end of something that should never have begun. Renoir's arc is ultimately a story about the danger of prioritizing the people we love over the people we have never met. Aline was his priority. Getting her back was his goal. The painted people of Lumière were, to him, abstractions, potential casualties of a plan he had convinced himself was justified. This is a moral failure that most of us recognise, not because we've done anything as dramatic as what Renoir did, but because we know what it feels like to care more about the people inside our circle than the people outside it. Renoir's error was simply larger than most. The mechanism of his bias, the way he constructed a framework in which the people he was harming didn't fully count, is not foreign to human experience. That recognition is what makes him so uncomfortable to think about, even after the credits roll. He was trying to bring his wife home. He destroyed a world to do it. And in the end, watching Painted Verso face him, watching the thing he made to protect his plan confront him with the cost of that plan, something in Renoir understood too late, what he'd actually done. The figure of Renoir also raises a question that the story doesn't answer directly, but that hangs over everything he does. What would success have looked like? If he'd succeeded in collapsing the canvas, if Aline had returned to the real world, what then? The real world is still a world where Verso died. The real Aline would still be the woman who lost her son in a fire, who spent 67 years inside a painting she made to survive that loss, who came back into reality older and changed in ways that cannot be unwound. The grief doesn't go away when the canvas ends. It was always going to be waiting for her on the other side. Renoir doesn't seem to have thought about this. Or perhaps he thought about it and decided that facing real grief in the real world was better than remaining inside the fantasy, which is not an obviously wrong position. But his certainty that the solution was to end the canvas, combined with his refusal to consider the cost to the people inside it, reveals something about how grief operates in this story. It does not make people wise. It does not grant them perspective on others' suffering. It makes them focused on the specific loss they're living with, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else. Maelle does not know she is Alicia. She does not know she came from outside the canvas. She does not know that her mother is the Paintress, that the being who's been erasing people from existence every year is the woman who loved her and who she loved in return. She doesn't know any of this for most of the story. She knows only that she is Maelle, that she's part of Expedition 33, that she loves the people she has journeyed with across the continent, and that she intends to reach the Paintress and stop the Gommage. When she learns the truth, it does not arrive gently. The revelation of Maelle's real identity is one of the story's most carefully constructed moments, because it doesn't arrive as a single bombshell but as a series of pieces that the character and the player have to assemble together, each piece making the picture slightly more complete and slightly more devastating. The memories begin to surface before she has the context to understand them. Fragments of a different life, images and feelings that don't fit inside the world she thought she was born into. A fire. A face that isn't Verso's face from the canvas, but some other Verso, the original one, the one who died. A name that isn't Maelle. She is Alicia. She went into the canvas to help her mother. The canvas unmade her and remade her into someone else. And now she is both. Alicia, who remembers the real world, and Maelle, who grew up in Lumière and loves Gustave and crossed the dark shores and has been fighting to save a world that her mother made. The emotional complexity of Maelle's position at the story's end is almost impossible to summarize cleanly. She is the daughter of the person they came to defeat. She is a painted person who is also a real person. She loves people on both sides of the canvas. The expeditioners she has travelled with, and the mother she has learned is the Paintress, and the real-world family she no longer fully remembers. She is the only person in the story who genuinely understands both worlds, who has lived in both, who carries both within her, and she has to choose. Think about what this choice actually costs her before we discuss what it means. If she follows Verso's path and ends the canvas, she is choosing to end the world she grew up in. Every person she met in Lumière, every street she walked, every expeditioner who ever departed before her, all of it ends. The Gustave she loves, the Lune who taught her things, the Ciel who fought beside her, they were painted people, which means ending the canvas means ending them too. Even if they have already died during the expedition, their existence in any form requires the canvas to continue. Maelle would be choosing to erase the world that made her Maelle. If she stays and takes on the Paintress's role, she is choosing an eternity of obligation. She becomes the thing the expeditions were sent to destroy. She sustains a world that she now knows is a painting, that the Gommage will continue in some form, that she will have to manage forever, or at least for as long as she's capable of managing it, which in the absence of external intervention might be a very long time indeed. Neither option allows her to simply be Maelle, the girl from Lumière who wanted to stop the Gommage and go home. She has grown beyond that possibility. The question now is only which kind of loss she's willing to carry. The moment when Maelle learns the full truth of what she is, not just that she came from outside the canvas, but who she was, who her family was, what her mother made and why, is one of the most carefully constructed emotional beats in the entire game. It arrives in stages, as we said, but there is a specific moment when the last piece falls into place and Maelle understands completely, and the game doesn't flinch from how devastating that understanding is. She's been fighting to reach the Paintress to stop the Gommage. The Paintress is her mother. The Gommage is her mother's grief, mechanically expressed as an act of creation rather than an act of cruelty. The world she grew up in, the people she loves, the expedition she's given everything to, all of it exists inside her mother's pain. She is Alicia, who entered the canvas to try to help, and she is Maelle, who grew up not knowing she was there on a mission, and she is the only person alive who is simultaneously inside the canvas and not of it. Both painted and real, both the world's daughter and its foreign element. She contains within her the capacity to end this story from either direction, and the game trusts her, and by extension, trusts you, to make the choice without telling you which one is right. The final confrontation of Expedition 33 brings together everything the story has been building toward. All of the threads, all of the revelations, all of the relationships forged across the terrible journey of this expedition, and the history of all the expeditions before it. And it arrives at a choice that the game does not make for you, because the game understands that this is not the kind of question that has a correct answer. The choice is this: end the canvas or preserve it. Ending the canvas means ending Aline's grief-made paradise. It means the painted world ceases to exist, not a slow death, but an ending, the way a story ends when someone closes the book. The people within the canvas do not continue. Lumière stops, the continent stops. Every painted person, every life built within this world over the 67 years of its existence, simply ceases. The real Aline is freed from the canvas, returns to the real world, faces the grief that she has been hiding from, lives, if she can, with the loss of Verso and the loss of the world she built to avoid that loss. This is Verso's ending. The painted Verso within the canvas is at some level the last surviving piece of the real Verso's consciousness, a fragment of soul that Aline's love and power captured when she built this world. He does not want to continue. He is tired. He has been sustaining the canvas from within for longer than any person should have to sustain anything, and he wants, more than anything, to stop. His ending is an act of release. The canvas ends, Aline is freed, and whatever remains of the real Verso's soul finally finds the peace that death was supposed to bring but that Aline's love prevented. Maelle's ending keeps the canvas alive. She takes over as the Paintress. She steps into her mother's role, takes on the burden of sustaining this world, becomes the new creative force that keeps the painted people alive, and Lumière running, and the continent existing. Aline, freed from the active maintenance of the canvas, can rest within it, can exist in the world she made without the constant effort of sustaining it. The Gommage continues, because the canvas still needs to manage its chroma, but Maelle is now the one determining its terms. The choice between these two endings is not a choice between good and evil, or between courage and cowardice, or between selfishness and sacrifice. It is a choice between two different kinds of love, and two different understandings of what the people in the canvas deserve. If you follow Verso, you're saying that the painted people, however real they have become, however valid their lives within the canvas, are ultimately part of a delusion that needs to end. You're saying that Aline's grief, however understandable, has gone on long enough, and that releasing her, even at the cost of the world she made, is the more loving act. You're saying that there is more dignity in ending than in sustaining. If you follow Maelle, you're saying that the painted people are real and their lives matter, and they did not consent to be created inside a grieving mother's fantasy, and they should not be destroyed simply because their existence is inconvenient for the people outside the canvas. You are saying that Maelle, who loves this world and the people in it, has the right to protect them, even at the cost of taking on a burden that may last forever. You're saying that there is more dignity in continuing than in ending. The game does not tell you which ending is right. It presents both with equal emotional honesty, equal weight, equal care for what is lost in each direction. The critics who described the choice as picking a favourite child were not wrong. These are not options in a puzzle. They are two different visions of what compassion means, and they cannot both be true at the same time. What both endings share is the absence of a happy resolution. Verso's ending is the ending of a world. Maelle's ending is the beginning of an eternity of obligation. Neither delivers triumph, neither delivers rest. They deliver different kinds of continuation, different ways of carrying forward the grief that is the canvas's deepest truth. This honesty is one of the things that makes Expedition 33's story so unusual. The lead writer said, in an interview after the game's release, that they never seriously considered writing a truly happy ending for this story. Not because they wanted to be grim for grimness's sake, but because the material itself, grief, loss, the things we build to survive our losses, the question of when those things need to end, doesn't resolve into happiness. It resolves into something more complicated and more true, into bittersweet, into the recognition that some losses don't heal, and some worlds don't get saved, and some choices come without the comfort of certainty, into the awareness that even a life contained within a painting is still a life, and that even the most loving act of creation can become, over time, something closer to captivity. There is one more detail about the endings worth carrying forward. Esqui, the Gestural companion who has travelled with the expedition, whose warmth and strangeness has been present throughout the journey, is revealed, in the story's late chapters, to be something other than what they appeared. Esqui is a puppet from the real world, an object that belonged to the real Verso, or possibly to Alicia, brought into the canvas and animated by the same creative force that animates everything within it. This revelation reframes Esqui's entire presence in the story, not as a native of the continent who chose to help the expedition, but as a piece of the real Dessendre family's history, present in the canvas the same way Maelle is present in the canvas, carrying something of the real world within it without knowing what that something is. The specific quiet grief of this revelation, that the companion you've come to care about is also a kind of orphan, also a kind of displaced thing, also carrying a history it doesn't have access to, is entirely in keeping with everything else Expedition 33 does. It is one more layer on a story that keeps finding new depths. The two endings are also distinguished from each other by their relationship to the phrase that has carried us through the entire story: for those who come after. Verso's ending says this: "We end the canvas so that those who come after, the real Aline, whoever she becomes once she returns to the world, have a chance to be present in their own life again. The sacrifice is the canvas itself, and what comes after is the real world, imperfect and painful and genuinely lived." Maelle's ending says something different. For those who come after means everyone still inside the canvas, all the painted people who will continue to be born and love and die within it, all the future of Lumière that will continue under her stewardship. The sacrifice is Maelle's freedom, her own future, and what comes after is the canvas's continued existence, imperfect and bounded and genuinely alive. The two endings are also distinguished from each other by their relationship to the phrase that has carried us through the entire story: for those who come after. Verso's ending says this: "We end the canvas so that those who come after, the real Aline, whoever she becomes once she returns to the world, have a chance to be present in their own life again. The sacrifice is the canvas itself, and what comes after is the real world, imperfect and painful and genuinely lived." Maelle's ending says something different. For those who come after means everyone still inside the canvas, all the painted people who will continue to be born and love and die within it, all the future of Lumière that will continue under her stewardship. The sacrifice is Maelle's freedom, her own future, and what comes after is the canvas's continued existence, imperfect and bounded and genuinely alive. Neither interpretation of the phrase is wrong. Both are faithful to what it has always meant: a willingness to pay a cost for the benefit of those who follow. The game gives you both options and refuses to tell you which sacrifice is the right one, because the answer depends on what you believe about what makes a life matter, and that is a question only you can answer. The final duel between Maelle and painted Verso, the confrontation that the game builds toward across its entire final act, is one of the most emotionally strange combat encounters in the medium's history. You're fighting someone you love, or you're fighting alongside someone you love against the mechanism that would end everything you know. The game's perspective shifts depending on which ending you pursue, and in both cases the combat is charged with a feeling that is not hostility. It is grief, expressed through the only language the game knows how to use for grief. The language of conflict, of direct physical confrontation with something you cannot resolve any other way. We've come a long way from Lumière's cobblestone streets and gaslit balconies, from the ceremony at the docks and the phrase that the expeditioners carry with them across the water. Let's take some time now to sit with what Expedition 33 is actually saying, why this story has stayed with the people who encountered it, why it earned every one of the awards it received, why it is being talked about months and years after its release, the way that only stories of genuine substance get talked about. Expedition 33 is, at its deepest level, a story about grief and the things we build to survive it. This is not a subtle theme. The game wears it openly from the moment you understand who the Paintress is and why she made the canvas. But the way the story approaches this theme is more layered than it first appears. Aline's grief for Verso is not portrayed as pathological in any simple sense. It is portrayed as love that exceeded its context, as a mother's loss that was large enough to require an entire world to contain. The canvas is not a failure of character or a sign of weakness. It is a measure of how much she loved him. The fact that it has become, over 67 years, something that causes tremendous harm, that the Gommage erases people, that Renoir's plan kills people, that the entire system is predicated on a grief that was never supposed to last this long, doesn't change the origin of it. The canvas began in love, that love is still there, still real, in every lamp in Lumière and every meadow on the continent, and every painted person who has ever lived within it. This complexity in how Expedition 33 portrays grief is one of its most important contributions. Grief is not simple, it does not follow a timetable, it does not become unreasonable after a certain number of years. The things people build around their grief, the ways they reorganize their lives, their identities, their relationships to other people, these things can be genuine expressions of love even when they have become harmful. Aline is not wrong to have grieved. She is simply, tragically, in a situation where the continuation of that grief has consequences that extend far beyond herself. The question the story is ultimately asking is not whether Aline should have grieved. Of course she should have. The question is whether she should stop. And the answer to that question is not as simple as the premise makes it sound. The Gommage, as a metaphor, deserves its own consideration. It is one of the most elegant pieces of allegorical world-building in recent memory. A countdown to death that everyone knows about, that no one can stop, that shapes every aspect of how people live within it. It is obviously mortality. Not a metaphor for mortality in a once-removed interpretive sense, but mortality rendered visible and specific and numbered, transformed from the vague background certainty that it usually occupies in human life into the concrete, calendared fact that it actually is. What happens to a society that knows this? The game argues that it becomes more human, not less. More intensely alive, more committed to love and art and science and the passing of knowledge to those who come after. The people of Lumière are not defined by their despair. They are defined by what they do despite and because of their awareness of death. They make things that will outlast them. They love people they know they will lose. They send expeditions that they know will probably fail. They do all of this not because they are naive about the odds, but because the alternative, to stop, to give up, to spend the time they have waiting for the time to be over, is unthinkable. This is an argument about how to live in the face of death that is no less true for being made through the specific mechanism of a painted world with a countdown on a stone monolith. We all know the number is falling. We don't know what our number is, which is both better and worse than knowing. The people of Lumière have a specificity of knowledge that we are spared, but they respond to it the way the best of us respond to the more general awareness, by choosing to matter in the time they have, for those who come after. The question of what makes a life real is another of the themes that Expedition 33 handles with unusual care. The painted people are real. The story argues this clearly and repeatedly, and the argument is not simply asserted but demonstrated. We are given painted people who love and grieve and sacrifice and grow, who are in every meaningful sense the same as the people we recognize as real. The fact of their being painted is presented as interesting and relevant, but not as disqualifying. Existence, the story suggests, does not require a specific kind of origin to be valid. You can be called into being by a grieving mother's love and still live a life that deserves to be taken seriously, protected, mourned. This has obvious resonances beyond the specific fantasy context of a painted world. Questions about what makes a consciousness real, what makes a life matter, what kinds of existence deserve moral consideration. These are questions that extend far beyond video games or fantasy literature. Expedition 33 approaches them through the particular lens of its world, and finds an answer that is both simple and demanding. They are real because they experience. They are real because they love. They are real because their ending would be a loss. The relationship between art and creation that runs through Expedition 33 is perhaps the most meta of its themes. A game about a world that is itself a work of art, created by someone with the power to make art real, made by a development team that clearly poured enormous love into every aspect of its design. The Paintress is an artist. The canvas is her masterpiece. The people within it are her creations, and the question of what an artist owes their creations, whether they have the right to end them, whether they are responsible for the consequences of bringing them into existence, whether the love that drove the creation can be separated from the harm the creation causes, is present in every scene. There is something quietly brave about a game that takes this question seriously. The Paintress made a world and filled it with people, and those people suffered because of what their world was, and she is both the cause of that suffering and the love that made their world possible. This is not a paradox that resolves, it simply is. And living inside a paradox that doesn't resolve is something that art, real art, the kind that stays with you, sometimes asks us to do. The characters of Expedition 33, Gustave, Maelle, Lune, Ciel, Renoir, Aline, are all people doing their best in situations that don't have good answers. Gustave grieves Sophie and channels his grief into a mission that turns out to be both necessary and insufficient. Maelle is caught between a world she loves and a world she came from, and a mother she's only just found and must already leave behind, or protect through sacrifice. Renoir loves his wife and destroys a world trying to reach her. Aline loves her son and destroys herself trying to keep him near. None of them are wrong exactly. None of them are entirely right. They are human in the fullest sense of that word, driven by love into decisions that have consequences they didn't intend and can't fully control, trying to do what's right in situations where what's right is not available as an option. This is why Expedition 33 stays with you. Not because it is a puzzle that resolves into a satisfying answer, but because it is a question that opens outward, that connects to the actual texture of how life works, where the people we love leave us, and we have to figure out who we are in the space they leave behind. Where the things we build to survive grief can themselves become harmful over time, where the decision to let go of a person, of a world, of a version of yourself that was made for a context that no longer exists, is one of the hardest decisions any of us ever makes and is never made cleanly or without cost. Expedition 33 earns its awards not through spectacle, though it has spectacle, and not through innovation in game mechanics, though it has that too. It earns them through the quality of its emotional honesty, through a willingness to make you care about people who aren't real in a world that isn't real, and then ask you a question about what to do with that caring that you cannot answer, without revealing something about what you believe. For those who come after, the phrase lands differently at the end of the story than it does at the beginning. At the beginning, it is about sacrifice, about the expeditioners who go knowing they will die so that others might live. At the end, it is about something larger. It's about everyone who has ever made something that outlasted them. Every painter and parent and teacher and lover who poured something of themselves into the world and left it there when they were gone. It is about the question of what we owe the things we create, and the people we love and the worlds we build, however small, in the time we have to build them. The Paintress made a world for her son. The world outlived its purpose and became something she could no longer control. And the question of when to let it end is, in the end, the same question that everyone who has ever lost someone has had to answer for themselves. Not about painted worlds, but the grief that lives in you, the space you make for what's gone, the moment when love of the living has to find a way to coexist with love of the lost. There is no version of that question that doesn't hurt. But Expedition 33 argues, quietly, persistently, through every act of courage its painted and painted real people perform across the length of its story, that asking it honestly is the beginning of something, not healing exactly, something. A step toward a future that contains the loss rather than hiding from it, that carries the grief rather than being consumed by it. One aspect of the themes that hasn't been mentioned yet is what Expedition 33 says about art itself. The game is, in a very literal sense, a game about what art is and what it can do. The Paintress is an artist in the most extreme possible version of the word, someone whose art is so complete, so fully realized, that it creates actual worlds with actual people in them. The Dessendre family's power is the power of pure creative will taken to its logical extreme, and the consequences of that power, the canvas, the Gommage, the 33 expeditions, everything we've discussed tonight, are, in this light, a meditation on what happens when art becomes a substitute for living rather than a companion to it. Aline didn't make the canvas instead of grieving, she made it as part of grieving. But over time, the canvas became the thing that made it possible for her not to finish grieving, to stay in the process rather than move through it. Art can do this. The things we make in response to loss, the journals and songs and paintings and stories, can be genuine processing, or they can be a way of staying close to the thing we lost without ever fully letting it be gone. Aline's canvas is both. It is genuinely beautiful, genuinely full of life, genuinely a testament to her love for verso. It is also a trap, for her, for painted verso, for the 67 years of painted people who were born into a world designed to help one woman survive her grief. The game doesn't condemn Aline for this, it is more generous than condemnation. But it also doesn't allow it to continue indefinitely. The story insists gently and persistently that the canvas has to end or be relinquished to someone who can care for it without being trapped in it. That the grief that made it cannot be the grief that sustains it forever, because grief that never ends is not grief anymore. It is something else, something closer to a refusal of the present in favour of a past that only exists in paint. There's one final thing to note about why Expedition 33 works as a story in the specific way that it does, and it has to do with the game's own relationship to the things it's describing. Sandfall Interactive made Expedition 33 with a team of around 30 developers, a small team, a first game team, in the sense that this was the first Expedition 33, even if not the first game any of them had worked on. And they poured into it exactly the kind of love that the story is about. The love that makes something that will outlast the making of it. The love that says, we are building this for people we haven't met yet, for the players who will sit with this story long after we've moved on to whatever comes next, for those who come after. The phrase belongs to Lumière, but it also belongs to every person who makes anything and releases it into the world without knowing where it will land or what it will mean to the person who eventually finds it. Every book, every song, every video, every story told in the dark while someone is trying to sleep. All of it is for those who come after. All of it is a message thrown forward in hope for those who come after. We have reached the end of tonight's journey, and I find myself in the same place I always find myself at the end of a story like this one, slightly amazed that someone made it, that they made it this carefully and with this much love, that it exists for us to sit with in the quiet of whatever night we're in. Expedition 33 is about death and grief and art and love and the things we make to survive the people we lose. It is set in a painted world and told through the adventures of a small group of people who crossed impossible distances to fight a goddess, and found, at the end of that journey, something much more human than a goddess waiting for them. It is one of the most emotionally honest pieces of storytelling I have encountered in this medium, and it has earned its place among the stories worth spending a late night with. The characters we followed tonight, Gustave with his grief for Sophie, Maelle with her two selves that cannot be reconciled, Lune with her faith in understanding, Ciel with her quiet precision, Renoir with his love that destroyed something, Aline with her love that made something. These are not simple people. They are the kind of people that good stories are made of, and good stories are made of people who want things they cannot have, and who make choices in the face of that impossible, wanting that reveal something true about what people are. Gustave's grief tells us that love persists past the conditions that created it. Sophie is gone, erased by the Gommage, but Gustave's love for her did not vanish when she did. It changed shape and became his reason for crossing the water, and it shaped every decision he made on the other side. This is not a metaphor. This is what grief actually does. The people we lose become part of the architecture of how we move through the world, invisible but load-bearing, present in the choices we make long after we've stopped actively thinking about them. Aline's canvas tells us that love can build things, and that the things love builds can outlive their original purpose, and that knowing when to end something you made with love is one of the hardest tasks available to any person. This is also not a metaphor. This is the question that every parent faces when a child grows beyond the role they were raised into. It is the question that every artist faces when a project has run its course, but still feels precious. It is the question that grief itself poses eventually to everyone who has ever lost someone they loved, not whether to stop loving them, which is not a thing you can choose, but how to carry that love forward into a present that doesn't contain them anymore. Maelle's choice tells us that identity is more complex than origin, and that who we become in the living of our lives may be more essentially us than who we were when we started. She is Alicia. She is Maelle. These two things are both true and they cannot be reconciled, and she has to build a future from that irreconcilable truth with whatever grace she can manage. This is again not a metaphor for a narrow category of experience. This is the human condition, just rendered visible in specific and extreme terms. If tonight's journey through Expedition 33's story gave you something to think about as you fall towards sleep, something to carry with you in the quiet dark, about the things you've lost and the things you've made and the question of when to hold on and when to let go, then this video has done what I hoped it would do. These are not comfortable questions, but they are the right ones. The people of Lumière live their beautiful, desperate, fully realised lives inside a painting, loving each other with the intensity of people who know exactly how much time they have. And somewhere in the quiet of tonight, in whatever space you're in, you're also living with an amount of time that you don't know and can't calculate. You can't see the number on your monolith. None of us can. Maybe that's a gift. Maybe the specific uncertainty of not knowing is what makes it possible to live without the desperate intensity of Lumière, to take things slightly for granted, to rest and breathe and be ordinary in the way that ordinary is actually a luxury. Maybe not knowing when the number falls is part of what makes the living livable. Or maybe the people of Lumière have something in their terrible specificity that we miss in our comfortable uncertainty. Maybe knowing that the time is short is exactly what makes them reach so hard toward each other, make things so fiercely, love so completely, send expedition after expedition into impossible danger with their hearts full of for those who come after. Consider the specific texture of what that looks like in practice. A city where people fall in love faster because they have to. A city where artists work through the night on things they know they won't live to complete, driven by the knowledge that someone after them needs what they're making, even if that someone doesn't exist yet. A city where the memorial walls have so many names that the names themselves have become a kind of landscape, the geography of loss that everyone navigates every day. A city where the ceremony at the docks happens every year with the same flowers and the same music and the same words, and where nobody has ever stopped going to it, because going to it is how they hold on to the fact that it matters, that the people who leave deserve to be seen as they go. That city is in many ways a more fully human city than the ones we build when we have the luxury of pretending we have unlimited time. The urgency is a distortion. No one should have to live under the Gommage, but the love that urgency produces is not distorted. It is simply concentrated, purified by constraint into something that ordinary conditions might dilute over the course of a lifetime. If Expedition 33 asks anything of us, listening in our comfortable beds, in our comfortable houses, in our comfortable uncertainty about when the number will fall, it is perhaps just to love a little more like that, a little more deliberately, a little more aware that the time is not unlimited, even if we don't know the specific count, a little more like expeditioners setting out into something uncertain with the people we love, making what we can while we have the time to make it. The number is 33, the expedition sets out, and somewhere across the water, in a painted world sustained by the love of a grieving mother, the people of Lumière live their beautiful, desperate, fully realized lives, loving each other with the intensity of people who know they have very little time. That's enough. More than enough. It is, in its way, everything. Sleep well for those who come after.